Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Andrew Gilden, Assistant Professor of Law at Willamette University College of Law. We will discuss his article, Copyrights Market Gibberish, which will appear in the Washington Law Review. So welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. As you know, I've always been a huge fan of your work, which is always provocative and humorous at the same time, which is a great combination. And I especially looked forward to reading this paper and enjoyed reading this paper because I heard you present an earlier version of it and really piqued my interest. So I was wondering if we could start the conversation by you just telling listeners who may not be as steeped in copyright theory as we are, what is this market gibberish of which you speak?
Sure. So this paper is part of a series of papers about uses of copyright that have nothing to do with money or the traditional economic incentives argument for why we have copyright in the first place. So if you look in different contexts, like the use of sexual imagery, religious texts, political adversaries, we see copyright assertions that are motivated by something that's not about trying to make money off the contested use. And I have another article coming out in the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology called Sex, Death, and Intellectual Property that makes sort of the normative case that it's okay to have some uses of copyright that aren't about revenue streams. And the pushback I got from that article is, one, I got a lot of pushback from it, but also, there's this notion that, privacy interests or sexual autonomy interests or even religious beliefs have no place in the copyright system. And what I do in this article is show that even if you don't want those interests to have a place in the copyright system, they already are all over the case law. But what courts do when confronted with these non-economic interests is use the language of markets to protect them. So if, for example, you have Bret Michaels trying to stop the publication of his sex tape with Pamela Anderson, courts will say, well, he has the exclusive right to utilize that market, even though he has said expressly that he has no interest in ever occupying that space. Or if you look at any of the J.D. Salinger cases, they're all framed in terms of a right to decide whether to publish or not. But the motivations behind those lawsuits are not about revenue streams or economic incentives. It's about privacy. Where on the flip side, when you have a plaintiff like Cindy Garcia who's trying to stop the death threats from the Innocence of Muslims video, courts say, well, she's not motivated really by economic interest, therefore her claim is denied. And what this article does is look at the way that courts, I'd say, contort market rhetoric to include or exclude certain plaintiffs.
So where does this idea come from, then, that copyright is exclusively about, or should be exclusively about, economic incentives?
So one might say that it comes from the Constitution, that the Progress Clause, as many have argued, has sort of utilitarian requirement, and it shows up in a lot of this, in actually a number of the Supreme Court cases from particularly in the 80s, Harper and Row, Sony case, talk about this economic justification of copyright law. And that language has been initially used to expand copyright, particularly around the Copyright Term Extension Act, the DMCA, that kind of more copyright, more incentives. And then the pushback against that is, well, actually, maybe we need to limit copyright to situations where only the situations where there's that economic incentives argument. And we see that pushback happening in cases like Garcia v. Google. There's a Fourth Circuit case called Bond v. Bloom. In some of the Hulk Hogan lawsuit against Gawker, where courts say, okay, if there isn't this economic incentive, then there shouldn't be a copyright claim. And I'm looking at some of the, I think, unintended side effects of using economic incentives, not just as a justification, but also a limit for copyright.
So how does this focus on economic incentives in relation to copyright protection sort of impact the dialogue or dialectic between courts and legal scholars writing in the area?
Well, I think it's a couple things. One, one of my concerns is that it makes copyright theory and copyright jurisprudence opaque, where courts say copyright law is about rights to exclusive rights in the marketplace. It's not about privacy interest. When courts are routinely protecting privacy interests through the language of markets. So courts are doing something very different than what they're saying they're doing, which makes it hard to actually intervene from either a lawmaking perspective or from a scholarly perspective. So there's a distortion function that happens with it. And one of my concerns is that actually some of the scholarly pushback against kind of censorship, copyright as a vehicle of censorship, or sort of the overexpansion of copyright, that sort of the scholarly concern gets used to block out claims of primarily people who don't have particularly strong markets, so that copyright becomes even more of a tool for the powerful, using some of the kind of First Amendment critiques of copyright. So there's this weird feedback loop that happens when courts are not straightforward about what they're really doing in these cases.
So to clarify, do you think the problem then is that this kind of market or economic rhetoric in a copyright context is obscuring from view what courts are actually doing, causing courts to make kind of bad normative decisions, or kind of some combination of the two?
I do think there is this obscuring function, and to some degree, I think there is this results in some bad decision making. I do think that what happens is that you have sometimes the market gibberish allows an attempt that is to really just squelch public discussion, like for example the J.D. Salinger cases, where he's preventing very transformative takes on Catcher in the Rye or biographical works, and that because he has the right to decide whether to exploit the market for his works. Whereas if you think of let's say like a revenge porn plaintiff who may have some very significant autonomy concerns, and in my view shouldn't be knocked out of the copyright system, because he or she can't conform their case to this need to make money off of, or this desire to make money off of the image in question. So I think what it does is the market gibberish provides protection to people who shouldn't have it, and excludes people who might need it.
Yeah, and that was one thing that I thought was really interesting about your paper, was the way you used a range of different kind of real world examples to show how courts seem to be, at least my take on it, or my sense of it was that you were pointing out how courts were almost using this market rhetoric as a cover for some kind of motivated reasoning. Like they were choosing who the winners and losers were going to be, and then using the language of the market to figure out how to get there.
Yeah, in ways that, in terms in the very same litigation, they'll have completely different rhetoric to describe the same motivation. So part of the paper looks at some of the Church of Scientology's lawsuits against former members, both former members and news organizations that have published some of their secret texts. And so when it's Scientology Church versus the Washington Post, the court is hammers the church for trying to censor the press, and that to say that there really is no interest in actually marketing this work. These are secret texts. There's not a copyright interest here. But then when the defendant isn't the news organization, it's actually a former member who has essentially sort of stolen texts and published them. The court says, "Oh well, the church has this right to decide whether to publish or not. They have the right to this market. These leaked documents could impact that market." And which just doesn't actually map onto what is going on in this case. So we see that the courts will use market rhetoric almost as a proxy for sort of a broader range of balancing, but a broader range of policy balances that are going on in the case. And my argument is that rather than try to use, is there economic interest or not to resolve these cases, there should be a much more thorough, transparent balancing of the interests that are actually at stake, which a good chunk of copyright law, particularly the fair use doctrine, already requires that type of balancing. But we're not seeing a sort of full range of consideration of plaintiffs' interests in these cases, even though you see a little bit more consideration of defendants' interests under several of the fair use doctrine factors.
Yeah, and one thing that struck me as being potentially quite uncomfortable about the argument that you make in your paper is that, it seems to me that especially in recent years, as you point out in your article, there's been sort of an assumption or kind of growing received wisdom that the way to cabin the excessive expansion of the scope of copyright is by kind of amplifying the use of economic or market rhetoric. And it seems like your paper really suggests that that's not actually as viable as people want to think it is. And in fact, it seems like the opposite is almost happening.
Yeah, so I think it does. If the goal is to cabin in copyright because it's gotten too expansive, this does cabin it in, but I'm not sure it cabins it in for the right reasons.
Okay.
So that that if you can't show a plausible market that is being impacted by this work, then you're out of the copyright system. That does exclude people who don't have an economic interest. But what it does is that it amplifies the ability of essentially wealthy copyright owners and copyright industries to protect their interests for whatever reason they want, so long as that they can point to a plausible market. And if all you need to do is point to a plausible market, then other interests like free speech, academic research, news reporting on the defendant's side, or privacy, autonomy interests, some of the interest of let's say of heirs on the plaintiff side, those tend to fall away. I would, if we want copyright to be a more inclusive and democratic system, then I don't think the economic interest is going to do the work the necessary work to sort of engage with the difficult policy balances that are inherent in the system.
Yeah, I mean, what really struck me was the way you kind of underscored how, the way that in practice the use of kind of economic rhetoric plays out, it runs totally counter to what we would normally think of as being equitable outcomes. I mean, essentially, it seems like in practice that, businesses or people with a significant market presence are practically speaking able to use economic rhetoric to achieve censorship or kind of quasi privacy goals, whereas the sort of non-public figure private people are effectively unable to do it. And it seems like that's really out of whack with how we would normally think the equities would run.
And yeah, I agree with that. And my concern is that sometimes that there's a tendency to kind of lump together all non-economic interests as being censorship. So if we, my concern is that we'll think about, let's say, a revenge porn copyright assertion as the same thing as, let's say, a business trying to kind of squelch negative reviews online. And if we think that if we can't distinguish sort of an effort to protect your sexual privacy away from efforts to stop criticism on a matter of public concern, then I think there's some real problems in the system. I mean, there are real problems in this copyright system to begin with, but I think it's important for us to sort of develop some degree of a hierarchy of values on the plaintiff side to ask, what is it that we're protecting here? And if we don't do that, then we get into a situation where we're excluding people who could really use these rights to make their life better. We're excluding them on principle, but not on without much of a moral basis. And yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it really struck me as well that, I mean, it seems like one of the kind of motivations for trying to move to this kind of, or amplify this kind of economic rhetoric, is to sort of make copyright protection and copyright enforcement more neutral. But it seems like there's kind of a sublimated normativity that pokes its head through regardless, that you sort of kind of highlight in a lot of the examples in your paper.
Yeah, there is. I mean, one of the concerns I have is that it sure seems like what's motivating the use of the market gibberish is the view of the parties, where, for example, Bret Michaels seems to have a justifiable market interest in his sexual privacy, but Pamela Anderson does not. And the court sort of mentions that certain people are kind of known for their sort of sexual celebrity and others aren't, and that kind of gets used against them. Or when you have if the defendant, I'm thinking of in the Monge v. Maya case from the Ninth Circuit, where we have a defendant that kind of stole photos from a USB stick for the celebrities, like the court is very obviously concerned with the bad actor on the defendant's side, whereas when we have a more legitimate news reporter on the defendant's side, the court won't engage in that type of market gibberish. So there's a lot going on in these cases that I think gets flattened by a sort of adherence to a strict economic incentives narrative. Copyright law is already complicated and difficult to explain and to predict outcomes. And the more that we sort of insist on a simple narrative, I think it actually becomes harder to predict.
Right. So one kind of question I had about the picture you draw of sort of how copyright economic rhetoric plays out in the courts is whether you think that the problem is fundamentally that the courts are sort of relying too heavily on this framework in the first place, or that they're doing it poorly, right? That they're sort of using it as a fiction to achieve results that are inconsistent with what the sort of premise would suggest they ought to be reaching.
So, I mean, there is a fair amount of scholarship that critiques some of the same cases that I do by saying that courts really aren't, like for example, like the J.D. Salinger cases, where scholars are saying, courts need to be much more rigorous about policing market interest, not just looking at market harms, but market benefits of a use. And that if the courts did that, then we would really we'd be cabining in some of the censorship. I mean, one, I do think that if you are asserting an economic interest, it should be plausible and real. But I have a hard time seeing how you actually in practice draw those lines between what is truly economic and what is not, because oftentimes there's going to be a combination of interest at stake, and certain people are going to be able to point in the direction of, oh, look, there is a market, I could make money off of this, and those people will be able to get their foot in the door in ways that other people can't. So yes, I think the economic justification could be policed better, but I don't think that solves the problem, and I don't think it brings people into the system who otherwise could be in there and benefit from some of the remedies and that copyright provides that other areas of law don't quite as well.
Yeah. So do you think that our kind of current theoretical models are built well to incorporate some of the kind of more privacy inflected normative values that you're identifying and that clearly people do care about in many contexts? Or do you think we need to kind of reshape the model in some way in order to properly accommodate some of those values?
I mean, I think that there is a capacity in this area of law to accommodate multiple models, and I think there's often the scholarship is often framed in terms of the utilitarians versus the natural rights theorists. I don't think you need to you need to sort of be on one side of that debate in order to have a functioning system. And I also think that there are other theories like human flourishing theories that are being developed that can incorporate sort of a mix of economic and non-economic interests. I don't see much upside in having sort of a theoretically pure approach to this area of law. People assert their interest in a creative work or for a whole lot of reasons, and I think we shouldn't close off those motivations just because it doesn't map onto one particular theory of copyright protection.
Yeah, I mean, do you think? So one thing I was a little not entirely sure of the answer to when reading your paper was, do you think that we should value some kinds of desires or demands from potential copyright owners more than others? Or is your point more that we should at least be cognizant of what values are really at stake rather than using this kind of language to just obscures them. In other words, I guess how open-minded should we be about the kinds of claims that people want to bring under the rubric of copyright or some sort of copyright privacy hybrid?
Yeah. So the immediate aim of the paper is the second point, which is to say we need to be more courts and I think scholars as well need to be more transparent about what are the actual interests at stake. But the reason to do that is to develop your first point, which is a better sense of what is the hierarchy of values here. When does a privacy interest outweigh a free speech interest? When does an economic interest outweigh a free speech interest? When does a reputational concern, is there a difference between wanting to protect your commercial reputation versus wanting to protect your sexual privacy? And these are those type of ranking of interest, I think that is beyond the scope of this paper. But I think that is where the discussion jurisprudentially and scholarly needs to move. But we can't have that debate unless we first are transparent about what are the actually interests on the table. And to the extent that market gibberish makes it hard to actually have that discussion, that's what I'm trying to get at this paper is ability to say, okay, where do our interests in privacy, economics, free speech, news reporting, how do these all fit together? And that is obviously a bigger project than I can do in one law review article. But I think that's one of the important takeaways from this, is that you can actually start having that conversation once you're more transparent.
Yeah, and that, and one thing that really struck me about the argument that you made in the paper was the way in which, in practice, the way that this market rhetoric is deployed often seems to be, and you really illustrate this very effectively, I think, often seems to be like really callously dismissive of normative claims that it seems like we ought to be much more sympathetic to. Like whether or not you think copyright is the right way to get there, it seems like it's really doesn't reflect well on this sort of how would I say, like the sensitivity of the courts, as it were.
Yeah, I think a good example of that is the Garcia v. Google opinion in the Ninth Circuit, which says, okay, Cindy Garcia, you don't have a copyright. You don't have copyright in your performance, which that part of the opinion I'm okay with. But then when you say you haven't even been irreparably harmed in the copyright sense through death threats and losing and loss of job opportunities and et cetera. And the court says, copyright can't be everything to everyone. Maybe you could have a privacy claim here. When the court fully knows that there isn't going to be a privacy claim there because here the claim is against Google because Google has immunity under Section 230. So the courts are effectively knocking people out of any sort of redress by saying they don't have a copyright claim. But the reason they're doing that is because copyright can't be everything for everyone, and it does. It doesn't say much about our system where if the legal system is more committed to theoretical purity than to actually making people's lives better. That doesn't seem like a good litmus test for whether this is a good document or not.
Yeah. I mean, to what extent do you think that part of the problem here is, to use a phrase people have been talking about lately, a sort of weaponized First Amendment, as it were, sort of making courts, broadly speaking, and policymakers and sort of a broader kind of social rhetoric insufficiently sensitive to legitimate privacy concerns, whether sort of cashed out through copyright law or through some other vehicle?
So this gets into this is a point I addressed in my Sex, Death, and IP paper. I actually think copyright law and IP law it can be an effective way of sort of threading the needle of responsiveness to real world harms, without blowing a hole in First Amendment protections and intermediary liability. What it does, it says, okay, here's a specific instance where my image is being used in a way that harms me. Take that down without having to over police more prospectively and shutting down the whole system. So, but for example, like I think that there's been some criticism of some dating apps, like for example, Grindr has there's some kind of revenge porn lawsuits against them, and I don't think that we should impose sort of standard tort liability on platforms that are being, in your words, weaponized. But you can use, for example, a notice and takedown system under copyright to say, okay, when you know about this particular instance of this image being used in a harmful way, okay, we'll take it down without completely blowing a hole in the system. So, if we aren't going to even allow this type of IP rights to be doing this work, then we have to get into these, I think, harder questions about into these kind of bigger questions of is the First Amendment worth the costs? And I think this is a narrower way of addressing that issue. But if we aren't going to allow any non-economic interests onto the table at all, then that solution comes off the table.
Yeah, and I couldn't help but wondering, like, to the extent you suggest that copyright could be, irrespective of what we think about it kind of theoretically or doctrinally, a kind of practically effective way of accomplishing certain kinds of privacy goals, I couldn't help but wondering whether it might not suggest that we ought to think about almost kind of, and forgive me for saying it, but like actually kind of expanding the scope of copyrightable subject matter, or kind of para copyright, to include what we might now sort of uncomfortably fit within a right of publicity type rubric, and to say that maybe people should have some sort of copyright-like ownership or ability to control the use of, especially images of themselves used in ways that are kind of normatively improper.
Yeah, where I increasingly find myself in, after doing these few papers, is saying that is really thinking about giving more attention to publicity rights. I think either providing uniformity or just dealing with it at a federal level, so that we can get some of the benefits of publicity rights without having complete uncertainty about its scope, its duration, et cetera. Because there is an increasing, I think, sense that there is or should be some degree of ownership over our image, and to the extent that we can use the law to kind of reflect people's understandings of their own bodies and their own likenesses, then publicity rights, so long as there are, like fair use and First Amendment like defenses, can do some important work, because people are doing it on the copyright side for for identical interests, and the only real difference between a copyright revenge porn lawsuit and a publicity rights for revenge porn lawsuit is who pressed record.
Yeah, it's a very fair point. Well, Andrew, it's been a real pleasure talking about your excellent and very, I must say, provocative article. In closing, you want to say anything about what's next? I mean, I'm always looking forward to your new papers.
So what's up next is actually, so some of my previous work has been about the interest of heirs in estates in the IP system. So what I'm looking at now is actually a comparison about how, about actually who IP regimes, publicity rights, and copyright give what I think of as legacy stewardship, compared to other contexts. Like there's a estate planning law, and there's a recently enacted digital assets acts that all sort of prioritize different individuals within a person's life to decide how they are remembered. So basically, next work looking at the question of who gets to plan your social life after you die.
Well, I can't wait to read it. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much, Brian.
The time was 1935. The place, Tupelo, Mississippi. God sent this world a baby boy who was born in poverty. And as a boy he wondered what would be his destiny. His life was to be busy, and things would happen that even he couldn't believe. He had so much to give, yet very little to receive. He started with a song and a wiggle, and some people couldn't understand. But you and I now know that it was all in God's plan. No sooner had he started than he was to lose his most precious prize. Tragedy struck this young man's life. His mother died. By this time he had the colonel who was to guide his every step. And things began to happen that neither one could seem to help. He came home from the army and we saw him on TV. And because of that wiggle, they wouldn't even show his knees. His career grew and he started making movies. And this took him from us for a while. Even though he didn't like it, he still gave the world a smile. Then he came back to us in person, because to sing for his fans was what he really enjoyed. And when he felt that he didn't please us with himself, he was annoyed. We demanded, not understanding, that he give to us his all. He tried to do what we wanted for the big and the small. The demand for his records, or to have a glimpse or touch his hand. Bit by bit, this took its toll, for even he was just a man. Oh yeah, he was very happy living, and he wasn't afraid to die. Even now, though our hearts are broken, he wouldn't want us to cry. God, in all of his wisdom, even though we loved him so, he knew what was best. We don't understand it, but it was time for him to go. Let you and I in our memory never lose what he gave, because while he was living for God and country, you and I, he was a slave. Yes, heaven now is brighter though this world has lost the light. Take care of business, that's what he'd tell us. You must carry on the fight. Even his daddy and little Lisa, they must accept what God has done. Even though, like our Heavenly Father, Vernon gave his only son. Now the show is over and the curtain has come down. Elvis has left the building, but will always be around. Precious memories flood my soul.